Dana Denha here, and this is Let's Watch with the Ann Arbor Film Festival. Ann Arbor's annual film festival celebrates arts and artists of mediums of all kinds. Obviously, films are a major highlight of this 6-day arts extravaganza, but organizers also strive to make it an interactive experience. Joining me is Brent Coughenour with his live cinema performances that stimulate hallucinations and illusions at the 2023 Ann Arbor Film Festival. Welcome to the show, Brent.
Thanks.
So first, I always like to ask everyone to talk about your background, schooling, what sort of led you to be the artist that you are today?
Yeah, I guess I've been, interested in the arts for most of my life and kind of gravitated towards video and film, specifically after college, I should say before college, and kind of like studied filmmaking in college, went to grad school. Grad school is kind of where I discovered kind of new media really and started getting into programming. That's kind of what led me to this. I mean, I do kind of single channel experimental work as well, and have done that for a long time, but I've also been exploring this other vein of live performance for quite a while, and grad school kind of kicked that off because I was exposed to programming for media, and it led to these kinds of things where I am exploring systems that I can create that generate kind of abstract sound and imagery together and explore some of the facets of the perceptual system.
Talk about the aspect of creating the video images and then also having to do the live performance part of it on your end.
Yeah, I mean, that the idea that it's live is definitely a big part of it's an important part of the structure of it, because it allows for some improvisation. It allows for exploration, and so I kind of started with these by they generally, these projects issue out of some research or encountering some ideas from other people, other artists and researchers and people like that and maybe even building off some projects of theirs that they have started from, that kind of spurs ideas of things to explore, and so then I start programming some kind of system that has opportunities to kind of explore it, and then I work with that system for a long time to kind of find a pathway through it that explores some of or creates maybe interesting effects and has maybe an arc to it or a process. And so all of that, then leads towards this final presentation, which is evolving over time. I mean, I've performed these things a number of times, and they do kind of change as I continue to develop the project or whatever. But that's kind of the process for me for how I get interested in them, and then how I work on. I kind of work on them for a long time. Some of these I've been working on for years, and then it takes a long time to sort of find something that I feel like really works as a whole, and is ready to sort of like present in a sense.
So you would sort of say that no two performances are really the same. It's kind of fluid as you go.
It's true. I mean, I am sort of aiming for kind of the same effects, because there are certain specific effects that I want to get through, but it's done, it's never quite the same pathway. And sometimes, there are serendipitous things that happen, and sometimes maybe the best effects don't occur, so there is some variability to it as well.
So it's actually as you go, you're creating the video live too. It's not just the sound aspect of it.
Right. Yeah, there's two, I have a system that I've, kind of fallen on over the years that I've been working with forever, which is I use one specific program for sounds. It's Pure Data. It's like a graphical programming interface that you create patches, and then I send some data from that to a different program that I use for images. And then sometimes there's data that comes back, and they may go back and forth and feedback, and the sound may react to the imagery. But oftentimes the pattern that's most common is that I'll be generating sounds and then kind of culling data from the sounds that I send to the visual program, and then it uses that information to generate the imagery in real time.
Well, before we actually met, you told me that, these images are really meant to be viewed in person. So what are you presenting them on? Are they on a projector? Like, how do they come across that they don't get muddled when you're experiencing them?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I'm just using a laptop to generate it, and it'll be an HDMI feed out of the laptop. But capturing it is a different process from just presenting through that, even that HDMI feed, even at high definition. Sometimes it's the resolution that's an issue with some of these. There's one of the ones that I'm projects here that I'm not actually doing in the festival has a lot of very thin lines that are moving around, and even at high def or 4K, there's still a lot of muddled to that as they interact, and it damages the effects to a certain extent. With this new one of the new pieces, the newest one that I'm presenting, the biggest issue with that is the frame rate. It's presented at 60 frames per second, which is just very difficult to capture when it's kind of the intricacies of the flicker effects that are happening, and so they need to be presented as a live feed. That's really the only way that it really works.
Do you ever feel like it's too much for you when you're creating it? Because it's like when I was watching it, I was like, I could feel it in my eyes. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, that's an interesting effect to talk about because I actually love it. Like, it's kind of like candy for me, but I know people that it is a little difficult, like it's overwhelming. And I mean, what's happening is I think the reason for this, the intensity of it is that the visual system is being overwhelmed. It's more information than your visual system can take in, and so it's trying to make sense out of it. It's trying to resolve all that data, and it causes, I think, some tension and maybe some stress, maybe some anxiety. I think some people, Flickr is anxiety inducing, and it's a little bit too much for them. For me, again, I think maybe the key is to just sort of let go of that sort of pressure to resolve it and let it kind of wash over you. But for me, it's really pleasant. It's really enjoyable experience. I could sit there for hours and experience it. But and I think that's one of the central things I'm trying to explore too, is kind of the effect that these things have on our perceptual system and on the brain, on the way the brain functions. So that's kind of why I'm doing it, I guess, to some extent.
Was your art, I mean, you were talking about at the beginning, sort of how you became an artist like this, but was your art different to begin with? And then it sort of became this sort of generated imagery?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's more that I guess I have a lot of interests, and so I've done a lot of different things. And I mean, I started kind of exploring narrative language a lot with my earlier work, and some documentary kind of aspects. And then I kind of moved into some other maybe found footage, and I've worked in a lot of different realms, but this kind of live performance has been enjoyable, and maybe I was drawn to it specifically because of its abstract nature. And when you're making narrative work or experimental work that has imagery, concrete imagery, you're always dealing with ideas on some level, and that's powerful and that's meaningful. But there's kind of a freedom in getting away from rational thought, and that's kind of what this abstraction, these works that are abstract have. That's one of the appeals for me, has been that freedom from, sort of a tyranny of thought or whatever. I don't know how to phrase it exactly, but it is appealing to let go of that. And that was, music has always been really important and meaningful to me. And that was always a draw with, music often has ideas associated with it, but it doesn't have to. It can be purely an abstract language with no mental content whatsoever. And that's kind of what I was drawn towards with these live performances, is that freedom from meaning in a way.
We'll talk about that sound aspect and where you come up with the ideas for the sound that goes along with the imagery.
Yeah, I mean, the two pieces that I'm presenting, one of them was kind of born from work by this sound researcher, Diana Deutsch. She's been around for a long time, and she has pioneered a lot of research into the effects of sound on us and our hearing systems. And she had, she's I stumbled across a CD of hers where she has a lot of experiments that she had done, and you know, so she has one where she has these phonemes that repeat in each ear. I think it's maybe two different phonemes at the same time. And you know what happens with her specific pieces, your brain with this repetition of these single syllables begins to hallucinate words out of those things, and it changes. And even though it's the same material, you know, it sort of starts to manipulate your brain manipulates it and hears it differently. And so that was, you know, the genesis of this idea where I have you know, these sounds in these left and right channels that are also tied to colors on the screen and their relationship physically in space on the screen. And so it's sort of a jumping off point to sort of explore. You know, I added just a few wrinkles where there's some phasing that happens. Things go out of phase, and there are you know, multiple versions of a phoneme, the same phoneme, but at different pitches. And as they go out of phase, there's a little bit of like melody or rhythm that develops. And then on the imagery on screen, there are, you know, initially these three phonemes are tied to red, green, and blue, which when they're in sync is white, but then when they get out of sync, you start getting these color flashing. And so there's just, it evolves over time into something that's, you know, very sort of intense eventually, but also has a lot of different permutations. And so that was the genesis for that, was just that stumbling across this research and reading about, you know, what Diana Deutsch had done. And so that was kind of the instigator for it. The other piece also comes from the sound world. You know, the composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen has a piece called Contact, which is, you know, sort of a classic of, I don't know, electroacoustic mid-century stuff from the 20th century. And there's a moment in that, the middle of that piece, where just a few seconds, but he, you know, he's working with like pulse wave synthesis and just using these ticks to manipulate sound. And so at first this tick, you know, is like a rhythmic thing, but as you speed it up, it becomes a pitch on its own. You know, this fusion frequency is kind of the root of all of this stuff, where, you know, a pulse, when it's sped up, turns into a pitch, which then, you know, can become melody, it can become harmony, it can become timbre, depending. And so, you know, there's this moment in the Stockhausen piece where he moves through like timbre into harmony, into melody, into rhythm, and then back again into melody. And so it's like this single element that, you know, creates these sort of paradigm shifts in our perception as he manipulates it. And you hear it one way, and then you hear it another way, and then you hear it another way. And that was kind of the root for me for this piece, where, you know, I'm doing the same kind of pulse thing with the sounds and syncing those to flashes on the screen. They start as being, you know, discrete rhythmic events. It builds into a pitch-like thing. There are you know, once again, playing with the RGB white and the color as they split apart. There's and then it builds into all these different sections that sort of again stimulate this gestalt idea of like changing your paradigm about what's happening. You see it one way, and then you see these same elements kind of switch into a different frame of reference or whatever. I don't know if I'm doing a very good job of explaining it, but that was the root of it, was, you know, hearing this sonic piece, and it just spurred some ideas, and I started playing with it. I built this system and started exploring it, and it offered up these possibilities to kind of like, you know, do a lot of exploration with those things.
So this is just like an ongoing process where you're constantly building on the system and the images that you see, and then you get inspiration for the audio.
Yeah, yeah, it is very much like that, you know. And this, honestly, I've been working on, you know, it is a very long time, like a long period of time over that I developed it. I've been working on them, and I'll do it for like a year or two, and then I'll set it aside and I'll work on something else, and then so in the background I'll come back to it, you know. And so there is a long period of gestation and evolution, you know, to how these kind of develop and where they go, you know.
Well, obviously, you're going to be a part of the 2023 Ann Arbor Film Festival. You'll be on the main stage at the Michigan Theater. I think you have two performances. So you have the two different videos that you sort of discussed. But before we get into those a little deeper, are you performing a lot? Do you have a lot of performances throughout the year or?
I haven't done a lot recently, honestly. So I mean, I was supposed to do some performances of this series, two of the pieces, in 2020, and then because it went online when the pandemic happened, I couldn't really do it. It's not something that I could, show in an online sort of streaming format. So I had to cancel that, and then I kind of set performance aside. I mean, I wasn't, I didn't know when we were going to have in-person festivals again. And so I hadn't really touched this stuff for quite a long time. I was working on some other stuff during the pandemic and for the last couple of years. And so, I've only kind of gotten back into it this year and only just now, honestly, starting to think about where should I do it and trying to put together some travel and the possibilities of showing it again. There's a festival in North Carolina that I showed at earlier this year and did the most recent performance at. But that was really the only thing I've pursued. I'm just, like I said, just kind of starting to get back into looking at it again now.
So it's like a welcome back almost to being
Yeah,
back in
yeah,
person.
in a
Yeah.
way, yeah. Much delayed.
Why don't you tell us about one of the video live performances they'll see, The Sixth Sense Part 3. Describe it a little bit. I mean, you sent me some information about it. You talk about the effects that it'll have on the mind, which you've obviously mentioned a little bit about, but how it almost has like an effect on people with this depression, schizophrenia, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek quality to the description, but it is honestly also sincere in that, um, I mentioned the idea of the effects on the brain, which is one of the primary goals for me, or I don't know if goals, but just motivations and why I'm exploring it. I've been just sort of reading some of the research on neuroscience in the last few years, and they've made a lot of progress in um, imaging the brain and kind of like tracking brain states. And they've identified this thing maybe people know about, I don't know, called the default mode network, which is basically the way that your brain operates when you aren't doing a task of any kind. And when you are at rest, your brain sort of activates these certain regions. It happens to be the same regions that are involved with all of the processes we would associate with the ego or our sense of self, and but it also correlates, activity in the default mode network correlates to some maladies of the mind. And that's kind of what I was referencing, where there's higher, they've discovered that people with schizophrenia have higher activity in the default mode network. People with depression have elevated activity in the default mode network. And there are, they've come across ways to address that in research as well. Like there are certain things that reduce activity in the default mode network. There's a lot of different ways, actually. One of them is just engaging in a task. By doing activity, we trigger the task positive network, which is like turns off your default mode network. But also like psilocybin turns off the default mode network. And that's whether they've been doing a lot of research about psilocybin as a treatment for depression, I think, for that reason. But meditation as well actually has the same effect that psilocybin does, where it reduces activity in the default mode network. But I think for me, the stimulation of the senses is another way to reduce activity in the default mode network. And so that, for me, like the flicker, I talked about it being very pleasant. I mean, I can kind of feel a switch, almost as if a switch is flicking in my brain, and it kind of like turns off the sense of time, the sense of thought process, and it becomes very pleasant, in that regard. So I think, that for me is what I'm kind of referring to in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way about the effects of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, listening to you describe it the way it is for you, which will say I didn't sit long enough and just like let my brain turn off. But it reminds me of like, when you're sitting like laying in bed or whatever, and you like see something on the ceiling and you just stare at it and stare at it until like almost your eyes are like doing something different and transforming it into something else.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a focus on the senses, right? And you engage with that thing. And it's a similar thing to meditation where they talk about the idea of being present in the moment or whatever. And, focusing on your senses is part of that. And those are all things that seem to cause the brain to behave in a different way that we kind of like what we fall into normally, which the default mode network is really valuable in creating a sense like the things that the default mode network does are really important for us, creating a sense of self over time and making sense out of our experience and relating to other people. But it seems like dwelling in that place all the time, which is kind of what we default to doing, is somewhat unhealthy. It's like not the best for us over time. And this is all, very early days in that kind of research. So who knows what all will come of that. But that's something I've been reading about and just sort of tangentially exploring it a little bit on my own to see how it works for me.
Well, so The Sixth Sense Part 3 is on the main stage at the Michigan Theater. Do you know when it is going to be?
I can't remember. There's 2 different days.
I think one of
Yeah.
them is going to be a Wednesday, I'll say. I think that was The Sixth Sense Part 3. And then I think the next one that we're going to discuss right now, The Sixth Sense 2023, is going to be on Saturday. So
Okay.
why don't you tell us about this one and how it's sort of a different experience than the other one?
Yeah. I mean, this one is the most recent one that I have been dealing with. This is the one that's built around kind of the Stockhausen thing, and this is the flicker heavy one. And so they both are going to do. I mean, this one is, yeah. The other one doesn't have as much flicker. It's a little easier, I guess I would say, in terms of just it's not as intense of an experience, and so the people who, are made a little anxious by the flicker, Saturday might not be the right time to go. But this one is a little longer. It is the one that is built around the evolution from this pulsation that synchronizes with a flash of light to a stream of pitches, melody, texture, sound texture that is also correlating to visual colors and eventually shapes, and it moves through these patterns of I think I've said previously, Gestalt recognition, where you kind of like you see these parts as pieces of a whole, and then they turn into a whole, and then they break apart, and then they recombine in a different way. And for me, it's pleasurable to find these sort of paradigm shifts, the way your brain sort of like switches from seeing it one way to another, and I think, part of the inspiration for me in this as well is gaining a little bit of understanding about how our perceptual system works. For example, the flicker, when you see these, when your brain is stimulated by flicker that's faster than you can kind of resolve, there's a hallucination that happens, which is kind of this sort of spinning circular kind of mandala like shape. And I think this is kind of like what it tells you a little bit about. I don't know exactly what, but it gives us a little bit of understanding about the holes or the gaps in your perceptual system and where it breaks down. And I think that the mandala like shape is historically something that people associate with kind of mystical experiences or whatever, and it persists throughout history over time in a lot of different cultures and things. And I think it's because it's a way that our perceptual system malfunctions or whatever, or it's something a result that we get when it's pushed beyond its limits, and has been historically. So it's a common hallucination, I guess, that is interesting to take apart a little bit and think about.
Well, what do you hope for next with your art?
I will just probably just keep exploring some of these ideas. I haven't started on I haven't found kind of a new, I work on, other projects as well. So I've been working on a video piece, like an essay, like with actual ideas and imagery and all that I've been working on for a long time. And I've been kind of focusing on that right now, on the side or whatever. And so I haven't started a new one of these, but I do see myself looking for a new one at some point, wanting to get back into another system, build another thing and explore that. So I do see it as kind of an ongoing project that I'll keep doing. I've done 3 of them so far, and will probably continue to. I mean, I like, it is nice to have, it's a very different experience to work on that than on something that's about ideas and imagery. And so it's nice to go back and forth. It's nice to have things where I can kind of take a break from one, work on the other. They kind of like feed different parts of my creative experience, I guess.
Well, before we go, why don't you tell people why they should support the Ann Arbor Film Festival as an artist, as a viewer, and come check out these different sorts of experiences like yours, like the off the screens and the live performances.
Yeah, the Ann Arbor Film Festival has been a really great resource. I mean, it's really been one of the few places that is kind of supporting, this kind of work, and has been a resource for such a long time, such a rich history of supporting the arts, and supporting specifically, experimental film. As being somebody who's worked with experimental film, I feel like it's such a tiny art form, one of the smallest ones in terms of the opportunities. And also there's no financial really remuneration for it. So it's something that having an outlet like the Ann Arbor Film Festival is really valuable. And it's a really great chance to get a broad exposure to many different things. Like, like I said, there's a lot of experimental film that deals with ideas and imagery, and that's there. But then the fact that they're also promoting these other things that are abstract and a different sort of way to look at imagery is also valuable and important, I think, as well.
Well, I want to thank you, Brent, for being a guest on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
To watch this and other CTN series, visit youtube.com/CTN Ann Arbor. And remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'm Dana Denhoff for Let's Watch with the Ann Arbor Film Festival.